All right, Jordan. Why don't we get started? So we're really glad to have Jordan Nickerson here presenting. As I said, this is one of my favorite favorite papers in this space with you know, I guess frequent co-author Gonzalo Maturana. And yeah, I'd love to hear you know, what you kind of, you know, what you find exciting and what you do.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Johannes, the check is in the mail for like paying you off for saying such kind words, because I think you're over exaggerating a little bit there. But I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be able to just like talk a little about this. And like I was telling Johannes a little before this started, I'm going to try to like peel back the curtain a little bit. So the kind of ideas behind this, how it started, things like that. Like this as a PhD student are things took me a long time to figure out. Just want to kind of pass on that stuff. Okay, so just in terms of background, this paper, it really didn't start out as a peer effects paper. Essentially, and just to kind of set the stage, I think oftentimes when you look at just household finance in general, it's probably something that's talked about last week's. The question that you start with in terms of like what is household finance is, well, let's try to understand how households are making important financial decisions. And oftentimes what these papers end up kind of morphing into is like a study of, well, how well do households make important financial decisions? Because kind of what Teresa alluded to earlier, when you have a very infrequent event, you're going to see a ton of mistakes from a household. You're going to see them, they don't have experience with this. It's something where if you kind of learn by doing the first time you do this, it's not going to go well, right? And so a lot of times in a lot of settings, you see just frequent documentation of mistakes that are being made by households, right? And a lot of times one of these things that we kind of put forth as an explanation is, well, perhaps there are some informational frictions. If you put this in a rational framework and there's some cost to acquiring information or, anything like this, there's different ways you can kind of motivate it. That can kind of explain why households aren't doing the optimal thing. And that tends to be a loaded word, but it's, in general, this is kind of the focus on a lot of the household literature, right? And so having that in mind, I really want to start to think about and talk about like, why did we choose to study mortgage refis? Because like I said, this paper didn't start as a peer effects paper. It was really going to start out as a mortgage refi paper from a household perspective, right? And the reason why, if I'm thinking about this is like, well, why study mortgage refis? It's like, I believe in you want to go after really big questions. And if I'm thinking from a household standpoint in terms of financial decisions, what bigger one than things that are related to household wealth, right? So the idea of Teresa and Johannes' paper along those same lines, like this is the biggest financial asset a person is going to have. We really want to understand the context and the setting in which and the factors which impact a person's financial decisions when it comes to something that, far and away is the biggest asset for the, at least in the US, the average household, right? This encompasses or surpasses pensions and just general equity holdings combined, right? Now, at the same time, when we're thinking about, okay, this might be a reason to study refis is because it's related to, such an important asset. Prior literature has already kind of shown what we would say is like suboptimal mortgage refinancing behavior on both ends of the spectrum, right? There has been some literature that's basically shown that, and so Campbell has some work on this about some people are too slow or they will never refinance their mortgage, right? This is something that the industry practitioners like to call as, deadwood or woodheads in terms of their refinance behavior. And then there's other people that honestly, they refinance too fast, right? And both of these things kind of point to this idea of, well, maybe there's some informational frictions, right? And it really amazed me. I was just thinking like, all right, why would somebody refinance too fast? And then I started to doing a little just like random perusing of, household finance for dummies books, things you can get on Amazon, things that are supposed to teach you about, how to make financial decisions. And it's amazing how many of these things actually give you the wrong advice. They basically say, well, here's how you compute the present value of your benefits. Maybe it's $4,000. If that $4,000 is more than the cost of refinancing, which is maybe $3,800, then you should do it. And that's absolutely the wrong advice, right? This is a dynamic programming problem. You want to see, well, I can make $200 now, but if I wait a little more, I could get a bigger savings, right? So it's these things all just kind of point back to the idea of this is likely a setting where it's ripe for informational frictions, inexperience, however you want to call this, things that are going to push the refi behavior of an individual around and move it off this optimal path. Okay, so, why do I think this is kind of an important setting? Well, I think it has implications for monetary policy. If we think about it, mortgage rates are pro-cyclical, which means savings from refinancing is counter-cyclical, right? This is something in the financial crisis, you saw dedicated devices to influence or try to push people to refinance, things like HARP, to try to make this happen more, because we view this as kind of one of those paths which monetary policy can reduce the debt burden in a household, reduce their budget constraints, and boost consumption, right? So I think these things do have important implications, right? And so this is kind of justifying why are we looking at refinances in this setting. I will say it's you look at this and while I think this is important, I'm not afraid to say I think what Teresa and Johannes did in their paper is probably more important in terms of the actual decision of buying that house in the first place. You need to do that before you do refinance. But I think both of these things are, some of the bigger questions that you can start to ask in terms of, household finance. Another one would be retirement savings. Why do so few people have this? This is you want to think about these things in terms of what's a big question, first of all, and then how do I answer it, once I have that question. And so this kind of gave us a sense for the setting of why we're going to look at refinances. And then it gets to okay, if I'm thinking about refinancing behavior, what is that thing that's going to affect this? And you can come up with different examples or different possible explanations for this. But really, if I'm thinking about refinancing behavior, well, it's what this is going to take is learning some stuff about interest rates and the terms in current mortgages. It's going to take things like, estimating these savings, and then kind of thinking about, well, if I wait a year or wait 6 months, maybe rates drop a little more. So it's a relatively involved process, right? This is something that I can do a lot of work and try to figure this out on my own. But really, more likely, given the inexperience that people have in doing this, they're probably going to refinance once or twice in their life. This is a perfect example of something where I likely learn from peers, right? I essentially, when you think about this, I try to put myself, I don't know, my brother does, in the mindset of my brother. And it's just what would influence him to refinance his mortgage? And it's probably that he heard about it from somebody, one of his friends, somebody he works with, one of his neighbors, something like this, right? So it's you want this to be a very natural idea going in before you start to try to test these things. And at the same time, if I think about, well, what would happen if I did refinance my mortgage? I'd be super pumped, right? I'd just say $12,000 in terms of net present value on this thing. I'm going to tell everybody. It's almost like you want to brag about these things. You want to brag about if you got into Bitcoin early on and the price went up. It's you're not going to be shy about this stuff. So this is something that you are likely to talk to other people about, which you need this for peer effects. You need people to be willing to have these conversations. And so this is just one of those things where there was a thought process behind this, right? Now, the end result is, we don't certainly say that in the paper, right? You have to kind of shape this into taking a big picture of this. And what we kind of view this is a study of exogenous arrival of otherwise costly information, right? Otherwise it would have taken, some kind of cost effort for me to understand these rates, current terms, estimate these savings, but PureFX essentially crowdsourced this. They essentially gave me this for free. And what we're going to do is study the impact of this on this decision of refinancing. Now, you can think about this more broadly as just information arrival for broad household financial decisions. But really what we're looking at is we're going to specify, well, we're going to think about employment networks. And I'll talk about in a minute why we focus on that. And then this decision to refinancing, which I've already kind of talked about why I think that is an important aspect. Okay, now in terms of studying PureFX and just household finance in general, household financial decisions, this is something, if you're going to look into this, really what you need is granular data. It should be representative, and ideally in most settings, you want it to be a panel, right? These are things that without this, it's somewhat hard to do some tests in the cross section. Now on top of that, PureFX has way more challenges, something Teresa kind of walked through in the first part of today. I'm not going to go a ton into that, right? But I just kind of use this as motivation for like why I'm going to pick the specific setting we look at. So you have things like, well, one, you need to identify links between individuals. So Johannes and Teresa, they have incredible data on Facebook Friends. Like that is a true measure of links between individuals. A lot of times it's very difficult to find these kind of things. In addition to that, you worry about self-selection into peer groups. Of course, this is something, as you learn more about peer effects, you're going to see a lot more of this. And then this last point, and this is something that's really going to shape why, we're going to choose the setting we're going to choose, is you really start to worry about common shocks. I think Tracy was the one who used the example of a billboard outside of NYU. And it's funny you said that because I'm going to have that exact same example in what my slides look like. So, these are all these challenges when you're thinking about peer effects on top of just generally having a good panel to use for household finance questions. So, if I think about this, okay, what are characteristics of a good setting that are going to try to address some of these things? Well, the first, if we are thinking about the refinancing decision, this is one that's definitely born out of a, this trade-off between I can save money as long as I stay in my household. If I move, I'm basically foregoing a lot of these benefits, right? So if I'm starting to worry about employment risk and things like that, that's really going to push around my decision to delay refinancing or not. And so a good setting would be one where we can kind of strip out some kind of common employment risk across people. Again, you'd also start to worry about house price changes and valuation changes and just the premium for mobility, things that, Johannes and Teresa have done in their work on house prices, right? And so what you want is you want some things, or you want a setting where you can have geographical dispersion. You can have people in different areas, but also they're still exposed to the same common employment risk, right? And so if I'm thinking of candidates for this, a couple come to mind. Basically any civil service worker, a teacher, postal workers, firefighters, police officers. And the reason why I'd say these are good candidates is because they're going to be different locations for the same employer spread out throughout a city or a county or a state, however you pick this. Teachers actually wasn't the first, thing that I tried to go after this. I tried to FOIA postal worker information, and evidently you have to do that at each individual post office or versus like the nation. And so that quickly died. And I went to teachers. And the reason why, ultimately I went with teachers is because this is one, I think it's going to check off all these boxes. A little personal note, I have a lot of information in terms of institutional knowledge on teachers because my mom was a school teacher. I definitely used that as an in when I was like trying to get the Texas Education Agency to give me some data and had to assure them I wasn't going to screw over teachers because, I'm not going to put my mom's salary out there on a website and shame her for these kind of things. So what is an advantage of the setting that we're going to look at? Why do I think we kind of check off a lot of these boxes? Like Johannes talked about, county deeds, these are required to be reported by law. So when you're starting to look at things like refinancing decisions and purchases, we have really good, nice granular data on that. In addition to this, you start to think about, well, Texas Teachers 1 represents just generally a large portion of households. There's something like 800,000 public school workers in Texas. And you can start to make these arguments that Texas teachers are very, they'd be very similar to teachers across the US, and teachers in general aren't that different than the average person. So you can start to kind of think about this in terms of a representative sense of, we can think about this more broadly than just the sample that we're focusing on. And I'm going to have a test to kind of look at this. Now, in terms of studying peer effects, employment records are going to be really nice because they're going to allow us to identify this network, right? There are very much, it's very possible there are other networks, there are other kind of peer effects at play, your neighbors, the parents of kids in your soccer league, things like that. But we think that, given how much time you spend around your coworkers, this is probably a relatively strong peer effect, right? At the same time, and this is something I'll go into a little more detail later, and this is something I knew going in and why I thought teachers would be a very good setting for this. Teachers have virtually no discretion over which campus you're assigned to. I'm going to apply to a school district, and I'm going to go to whichever campus has openings at that point in time. You can't, have a say over, I'm going to go to this campus versus this campus to teach third grade math. Now, at the same time, we can start thinking about, something specific to our setting. We're going to be able to exploit this variation in campuses both across campuses, and ultimately we're going to find some variation within campuses that's going to really help us try to nail some of these effects versus common shocks that you can start to think about. So this is the point where I want to like show you a little bit how the sausage is made, right? This is something as a grad student, you see the end result, you're like, man, seems like that was super easy. It's never easy. The data is always messy. You always have to find clever ways to do things, right? And so once I finally got Texas teacher data, what did it look like? We had administrative data, had names, birth dates, gender, pay, tenure. It's got a last name in there, which is great. But if we're looking at refinancing records, you really have to connect this with county records, right? Now, the problem is if you look at the county deeds, it's going to have a last name. It's going to have an address and all this information. It doesn't have things like date of birth. It doesn't have a really strong way to link teachers to this data set, right? So you really have to start to be clever about, well, how are you going to connect these things, right? And this just took a lot of just thinking and planning and just thinking and just hitting your head against the wall. And ultimately, what we figured out was that electoral records, voter registration rolls, essentially give us that information to connect these two. This is something, you know, didn't have that going in. You just kind of hope, well, maybe we can do fuzzy matching with names and rough like locations of schools versus addresses. But at least in the state of Texas, you can get a voter registration roll that's going to give me everything I need. It's going to give you date of birth and gender and name. And it also lists your address, which we can then connect to county records. So this is something that, you know, inevitably any empirical project is going to face some kind of hurdle. And you just have to be creative at, you know, ultimately what you do to figure out a way around it. Now, at the same time, what is this going to do? This is going to condition my sample. And I do need to think about, well, if I'm going to condition this on voters, you know, what is the external validity or what can I learn about non-voters out of this? And so we're going to have, you know, a figure that's basically going to try to let us understand how far can we push the results that we're going to learn in terms of like the external validity of them. Okay, so this gets to that representative nature, right? You're going to face this trade-off between type identification and validity, right? And so with Texas public school employees, you have granular administrative data. It's going to let us do some things with peer effects, but you worry about this potentially being different than the average household. And so this is something in a paper you definitely want to show, you know, how does our, you know, sample break down or not break down relative to a general population? And so an easy way to do it in our setting, which was the first step that we had to do, was, well, what does refi activity look like for our sample versus the general population? So the approach we just took was, well, let's just plot refi activity for teachers versus all voters, because this is essentially the sample you're restricting to. It's going to tell you if teachers are different than the average voter, and then relative to non-voters, right? And you're just going to see that through time and see like, well, these things really close to each other, they differ dramatically. And so this was that plot. And, you know, we had to be forthcoming in the paper. It's while throughout most of the sample, in terms of, you know, people that are teachers versus people who are just voters and non-teachers, they do track through most parts of the sample, but there is a little less exposure in terms of 2003 of voters versus teachers. Teachers tended to be a little more active in their refinancing. So it's something we just had to be upfront about. And it's, you know, it's not that teachers are extremely special. You can think of them as maybe having a little bit more stable job prospects than most people. And so, you know, maybe this is an explanation for this. We didn't have a perfect answer for why they were a little more sensitive, but it's something you do want to kind of put out there. Now, at the same time, the confidence bounds on this are relatively high to where you would say, well, it's still within the 95% interval in terms of this point estimate and this, but they do look slightly different. Just something, you know, it's not the perfect sample in terms of representatives, but it's not just wildly different throughout the entire time series. Now, you know, putting that point aside, you start to think about, all right, what are confounding effects? How can we really nail down peer effects in this, right? And this is something that it's amazing how many times you've probably seen this. You're probably tired of hearing about, okay, peer effects versus common shocks, because it's been mentioned about, you know, once every 30 minutes so far today. Funny enough, I have another one. And so you start thinking about, well, what is a common shock? And I mentioned employment concerns, and that's where really using variation and where you're assigned, which campuses you're going to be assigned to is going to help you out in terms of, you know, layoffs, job cuts, wage increases or decreases. This is all a district level effect. And so as long as we have somebody at one campus versus another campus within a district, we can kind of sweep that out with district by time fixed effects. So we can kind of avoid those employment shocks, but there's still other things that we think about. And this is that example. What if there was a billboard that's put outside of a campus advertising a lender's mortgage rates, right? This is something that, of course, I would be concerned about that would move all people in one campus to refinance relative to another one. And if I'm defining peers as other people on that campus, I'm going to confuse peer effects for this common shock. Okay, now this is something that, I think it's really important because I think you look at the final product and you're like, man, that's, I think that's a really cool strategy. That's great. Like, don't know how they ever came up with that. I'm gonna be honest with you. The initial identification strategy, we didn't have it when we were doing this. So the initial one, I was gonna plan on doing was essentially use commonality in terms of the subjects that you taught. If you're a math teacher, you're more likely to teach other math or talk to other math teachers and use that as that source of variation to give me peer effects or peer groups within a campus. And it was only after I kind of solicited the state and got the data that I realized that we had a better source of variation, which was teachers' schedules, like teaching schedules. When do they have an off period and when are you teaching classes? And I'm gonna be honest, it took me, over a week to come up with a strategy, even though I had the data. It's just like, it's not something that you immediately have. It just takes time. Like, this is what research is. It just takes time to come up with new ideas. You let stuff just kind of marinate for a while, and then you get true inspiration at some point. And so this is what our strategy is going to be. We're essentially going to exploit the fact that teachers, these black bars represent when you teach. The colored blocks represent the time where each teacher has an off period. And the nice thing is teachers have off periods, they're staggered throughout the day, right? And so in this example, Bob has his off period between 10:30 and 12:30. Ava has one in the morning and the afternoon. Kim has one midday in the afternoon. And so you can see from this that, well, Bob and Kim share an off period of 45 minutes. Kim and Ava share one of 45 minutes. Ava and Bob don't really share a meaningful off period together. Now, this is something that, once you started thinking more about schedules, it's just like, this is going to be the perfect source of variation, because I already knew from my mom's experiences and having, aunts that worked in school districts that they have, no discretion over when their teaching schedules are lined up. These things are basically optimized to where students get the classes that they need and they get first period athletics and things like that. And so that is the identifying assumption that we're going to be making, is that teachers don't have discretion over these off periods. And it's something we're going to test before we kind of go on. And then we're going to think even more about, well, how can this push around effects as we get into the actual results, right? And ultimately, this is that source of variation that's really going to let us strip out things like a common, billboard sitting outside the campus. It's just the idea that, well, if I share a common off period, I am more likely to interact with this person. If I refinance and I'm saving money, I'm more likely to tell them about this. Okay, and so how do you demonstrate that they don't have discretion, or that this isn't going to be related to some other effects? You just have to rely on observables, right? So essentially what you want to look at is, how do the observable characteristics of teachers relate to teachers that we classify as peers, those that have at least one off period with them, versus a random teacher, right? And generally, the way a lot of times you do this in peer effects literature is you're going to contrast this with what you'd call a pseudo peer group, where you're going to randomize peer groups or randomize off periods across everybody, do this 10,000 times to get a distribution of what this should look like under the null of just completely random peer groups, right? And that's what we're going to do here. And you're going to see that, okay, this is the mean absolute difference in characteristics. So anything to the left would be that you do have a tenure that's closer to the person in your peer group than somebody that's not in your peer group. And there's going to be two things that kind of pop out of this. So, ideally these things would all be right down the middle. And that's not the case here. But at the same time, I want to focus both on the statistical significance. You got to realize you're running 4 different tests. And so you have a multiple hypothesis kind of testing, and the economic significance. So it's a little hard to see the numbers here, This is 7.48 years, 7.46 years. So 0.02 years is something like 6 days difference in terms of tenure. So economically, this distribution is extremely tight. Anything within this range, you're talking about 6 days difference in terms of average tenure. So extremely small economic magnitudes. Another one that we found really interesting was, well, if you are more likely to end up in off periods with people that look like you, people that you're friends with, things like that, your pay should be closer to that person than an average peer. The fact that this is on the right side of the distribution, there's no real economic story for why you'd have a bigger dispersion in pay relative to, a random group, right? So we kind of chalk this all up to the fact that while these are borderline marginal in terms of statistical significance, economically they're small, and it's really hard to tie a story to put this together of having some discretion over the off periods that you have. Now, at the same time, you don't want to just put that up there and say, so we're good, no need to worry about this. You still want to do everything you can to kind of alleviate, readers' concern that this is something going on. And so, what the typical strategy that we do and we follow, we're just going to completely saturate the model with as many of these characteristics as we can. We're going to take just the raw characteristics of peers, the commonality between peers and a teacher. We're going to let all these things vary at the district by year level, right? Just try to completely saturate out this model. And you always wonder, well, can I take it a step further? Can I alleviate their concerns even more? And if you start to think about, well, maybe teachers somehow have access to, or more tenured teachers have the ability to pick certain off periods that they really like. They really want first period off because, you're still waking up in the morning, things like that. Well, that's something we can also explicitly control for, right? Essentially putting in a fixed effect that's going to take care of which off period was I in, right? And I'm going to let this vary at the district by year level as well, basically just to, try to sweep out any of these other stories. So with all this, I wanted to talk a little more about the setup. I understand I'm very kind of close on time, so I'm not going to go too much into the results. I'm going to show you the main result and then one really cool cross-sectional test that we have. But essentially, this is that main result. So, what we have is, this is a 3-month trailing activity of your peers. So it's, if I had one peer refinance out of 5 total peers, it's 20% of my peers that refinance. Now, in terms of economic magnitudes, it's really hard to interpret that. And so we standardize this. So this is a 1 standard deviation increase in peer refinancing in the trailing 3-month period prior to this. And then these point estimates are going to be in basis points. And so what you're going to see is, before you start allowing for crazy district by year variations in this, you get about a 10.7 basis point increase in my monthly likelihood of refinancing. So I didn't go over this, but the unconditional likelihood of refinancing is 70 basis points. So you're talking about a 14% relative increase. So this is a pretty sizable effect. But when you think about how rare refinancing is, how inexperienced people are, how many mistakes they make, it's not that surprising that learning from your peers is going to have a big effect on your refinance activity, just given that, otherwise you might not have thought about this at all. And then you can start doing things like allowing this to vary, different characteristics to vary at the district by year level, or putting in these time slot fixed effects, which is essentially, did you have first period off? Yes or no. Second period off? Yes or no. Just a complete set of fixed effects for that. And you see that you still get around 14 basis points. Gets a little stronger statistically. So in terms of economic magnitudes, this is about a 20% relative increase in your likelihood. So these are sizable events. Now, at the same time, we have some additional results in the paper. We found the results are stronger if you're doing it over a 2-month period. Just something, we want to do some robustness. We tossed summer months because this is when you're not likely to be around other teachers and learn from them. Results get stronger. We found that peers that share common ethnicity, the idea of kind of homophily a little bit, the effects get even stronger. Then we have some stuff in terms of using an IV to kind of reinforce this, and then looking at the choice of which lender you go to, just to try to tell this story, right? Just to try to build up evidence on this. But the last thing I want to really hit on is, you'd say, okay, maybe this is evidence of peer effects. He motivated this as informational frictions. That's not necessarily the same thing. I think this is really important to think about is, even though we frame this as information transmission, a lot of the stuff you think about when you think about peer effects, and something that's very common in the literature, is this idea of mimicking. I'm going to do something because somebody else did it, and then because we share this common experience, I'm going to get some social utility out of this. We can talk about that experience, even though this might not have been something I'd otherwise have done. So that's very different from an information transmission story. Now, fortunately, we have a nice prediction that can kind of separate these two. Refinance behavior in our setting, what helps us pull these two apart is information about rates and savings. That's not enough to convince me that I should refinance from a rational standpoint, right? That would be more like social utility from mimicking. I also really need to benefit from this action for this to be something that it is information. You tell me information that's not useful to me, I'm not going to use it. You tell me information that would benefit me and I act on it, that is me incorporating information in some sense. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to break out the sample into quartiles based on what would your savings be if you refinanced right now. And we're going to look at the effect of peers across each of these quartiles. And what you're going to see is the effects are just way stronger when you're talking about people that would save the most had they refinanced. So this is where the information is actually being acted upon. People in the first two quartiles, and these are where savings are NPV roughly 0 and even negative, you don't see these effects. So this isn't something that's likely contributing to just a mimicking behavior, which is something that really we thought could push this story over the edge in terms of this being information versus just standard mimicking behavior. Okay, so just to conclude, kind of showed you some stuff. I don't really want to focus on what the actual results were. I wanted to talk more through the process, try to give you ideas in terms of how you should think about things. We do kind of view this as evidence that strongly supports peer effects being important in the refinancing behavior. This is just, yet another setting that reinforces how strong peer effects can be for these very rare events that households face, that just kind of helps contribute to the literature that honestly, Johannes Teresa have done more than anybody to contribute to over the last 5 years, and just have really pushed this forward, which I appreciate being somebody else in this area. And sadly, this is something I built these slides off of some that I used a long time ago. And as I was going through them, I looked, and it just kind of made me sad because my last slide used to be, let's go enjoy some wine. But because it's now the age of COVID, we can't do that in person. I am still thankful for these two for putting this online and just opening it up to everybody. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jordan. And actually, the one result that I really like in your paper that you only touched on a little bit, but I found super convincing, was this idea that you end up borrowing from the same lender, right? It gets very, very hard, and sometimes with the mimicking type story. For example, it's, yes, you want to talk about the experience, but that doesn't, it gets much harder to kind of tell any alternative story once you don't just have to explain the fact that we refinance at the same time, but we actually end up going with the same lender. But that's exactly what you would expect when, you tell me I saved $10,000. I'm like, where did you go? Who's that bank that, has this great deal? And so you walk into exactly the same bank. And so I thought that was one of the most convincing pieces you had.